I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna
Here I am in 1967, drafted and in the Army. But I always wondered about the men who refused the draft during Vietnam. How had they resisted? And why? Of course, I also wondered what had happened to them for taking a stand against the war. So this is their story.
I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I'm gonna put on that long white robe.
Well, I was one of the early people. I was in fact over age with 2 children and thus exempt from the draft in 1961, late 61, when I sent my draft card back to the Selective Service. What happened, what caused that was several different political circumstances about which moral feelings can be manifested in all accounts. Kennedy was threatening, the way I felt at the time, he was threatening nuclear war. He was threatening Cuba, which had just had its revolution. And above all, for those of us who watched Southeast Asia for many years, as I did ever since, let's say, the fall of Dien Bien Phu, which was where the French were defeated in Vietnam, something very worrisome was going on with the sending of U.S. special troops, advisors, over to Vietnam. So the confluence of those 3 issues just forced me to refuse to carry the draft card, although I wasn't subject to the draft at the time. But the way the Selective Service handled these situations is that if you sent in your draft card, they send it back to you once more, and if you send it back to them a second time, you're drafted. In other words, they changed my draft certification. I forget the exact number, but it was not draftable because of family and age. They changed it to 1A. I was told to report for induction. I refused to report for induction. I then lost my job. I had been with United Press International for 9 years as a reporter. And they found out that I was under indictment, so they then fired me. And I worked for the next few months for the Committee for Nonviolent Action, which was the principal activist organization in the late 60s, in the late 1960s, 61. And then I was indicted, found guilty. I represented myself and was sent for a year. Now, I do know people who several years later received longer sentences than I did. And I felt that perhaps the year was somewhat lenient on the government's part because they realized that probably if I had decided to have a lawyer, which I didn't, I could have just gotten out scot-free. But it was a moral witness that I was making to oppose what I felt were the war maneuvers of the administration, and I felt that I would have to carry this through as a moral opposition. So I stood as a conscientious objector, though non-religious. It was difficult on my wife at the time. We subsequently divorced, and 2 children. And income was taken away. And it was a difficult period of time while I was incarcerated, and there was very little help. We didn't have a majorly sized movement at the time to lend a hand. Also, it was not a popular thing to do, to take a moral witness at the time. So there was very little support in the society as a whole. My father was dead, but my mother tried her best to understand. My family tried their best to understand, but they probably didn't fully. My wife did understand. She had been involved in the pacifist movement, so she fully understood this, but it was a hardship for them, and it wasn't easy to understand for family. But at the time, I had a burning opposition to war. I still do. And so I personally did not feel any anguish or pain, but except perhaps for that I felt for those about me who may not have completely benefited from my action. Yeah, well, in terms of the decision, it had been, I had always opposed wars. I opposed the Korean War as a 16-year-old, I believe, when it started. And were I to have been drafted for that war, I would not have gone into it. I've always opposed wars, and in fact have always been, even as a fairly young child, a socialist. I didn't come from that kind of family, but through reading and I guess compassion, I always felt that something was wrong with the system that had these kinds of wars and oppressed other nations. So those feelings developed throughout the years to the point that when I got to be 26 or 27, when I finally opposed the war through a propaganda of the deed, so to speak, I had utter conviction in the correctness of that course. And I've never doubted it since, to this day. I've always thought that was the correct thing to do. It may not be the correct thing to do tomorrow, but at the time when there were so few people out there, but we had a world on the precipice of a nuclear war. We were getting ready to invade a country in Southeast Asia. We already were paying for the war in Vietnam. We took over from the French and immediately started paying for it. We paid for the last couple of years of the French involvement, and then we paid for the continuing involvement and the sending over of our troops. I mean, this was a terrible situation, and it just seemed the only thing to do was to stand up and oppose it. Perhaps I should have joined a political party instead, or found another way to manifest it, but at the time I didn't. At the time, I felt it was the correct thing to do, and I've never looked back with doubt. I received direct advice from the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors in Philadelphia, which is an adjunct of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers. And there were people on the peripheries who seemed to care and gave the kind of support that they will give, and so that was approximately it. Of course, the left movement supported this as well, but not as intimately as those who shared a common hatred for the war. It wasn't that dramatic a price. If I had gotten 20 years, that would have been murder. But anyone does a year. I forget that there's a blues song, something to the effect that 10 years ain't no sentence, 5 years ain't no time. I learned a great deal out of the prison. I met some good people there. I read a great deal and felt that I came out stronger and better for the experience. So I don't look upon it as a great sacrifice at all. Perhaps if I had gotten a much longer sentence and had seen people around me truly fall to pieces, as often this happens with the ones on the outside, that's a different matter. But my immediate family held as firm as possible, and I didn't feel that I was making a great sacrifice. I kind of felt I was doing what I should be doing. Yeah. I wasn't going to be part of a war on an essentially peasant people who was seeking to exercise political hegemony over their own country. I wasn't going to be part of a war that killed 2 to 3 million Vietnamese people. I wasn't going to be part of a war with a huge country seeking to smash out liberation struggles of a small peasant people, and I'm proud I would never join that kind of war. No regrets whatsoever. At the same time, I don't hate those who fought. That's not, and of course, many people who joined fired over the heads of the enemy, and some of them fragged their lieutenants. Many of them joined servicemen's unions. The American Servicemen's Union had 33,000 members at one point and scared the hell out of the Pentagon. They were very brave, those people. They were braver than I was. They were in the damned army and they joined the Union, opposing the war. I had nothing but love for them and respect. But as far as going and feeling guilty that I didn't go and kill a peasant people halfway around the world, no, I would have felt guilty if I did. Sure, I taught my kids to oppose the war and to oppose unjust authority wherever it rears its head, and to be skeptical of authority. It's one of the great failings, I think, of the American educational system. It's not the mathematics, it's not the reading, it's not all the other things we wring our hands about. It's the fact that we seem almost to have extracted, as a doctor would an appendix, the critical faculty from the minds of our children. And I tried, I suppose, through this action and through my life to reinstall that critical faculty that the educational systems managed to just surgically slice out of children. We have a whole group of kids who could perform all kinds of marvels with computers, and exceptionally intelligent people who don't question unjust authority. And to me, it's like we're breeding a nation of sheep, and I don't blame the sheep. You know, it's very difficult to break out alone. We have to build a movement in this country that will oppose what the educational system is doing, that will oppose what the economic system is doing, what the military system is doing, what the social system is doing, the racist injustice system. If we love our country, we got to fix it up because it's in bad shape. And it's our responsibility to reach these kids, to reach them with that kind of thinking about questioning unjust authority and taking a stand, even if there's some small risk, some small payment you have to make, doing without a little bit. Like after I got out, I was blackballed. I was a journalist, almost 10 years at United Press International. They hired me when I was 17. They did that in those days. They don't do it anymore. And I rose to fairly responsible positions. But once I got out, not one commercial newspaper, not one commercial news magazine would even interview, because the word gets around. Oh my God, this guy opposes this and that. He's probably a communist. And it took 20 some odd years before I could get a job in the straight world. Fortunately, I was hired by The Guardian as soon as I got out of prison, because they knew I was a trained journalist and I was going real cheap. Stayed with them for 24 years, and finally after that, I was able to work my way through commercial magazines again. But it took all those years. That's the price you gotta pay. But it's a small enough price to live with your own conscience, I'd say.
I got an email from my daughter this morning, who's been working with an agricultural co-op in northern Thailand for the last year. Just finished her work there and is now traveling, and I got this incredible letter from her from guess where? How about, from Vietnam.
Amazing.
Yeah. And I was just struck by the irony of, like, exactly 30 years after I crossed that border, almost to the day, to immigrate, she's finding herself as a tourist in Hanoi and enjoying it thoroughly. Things do change. I graduated from high school in 1965, and I was an Eagle Scout with several palms, and very patriotic in my outlook. And if I had left directly from high school, I would have gone without a thought. And as I matured and asked more questions about what we were doing, my own personal odyssey on this started to the more I asked questions and the less comfortable I was with the answers, I started on a continuum that moved me away from supporting that action, so that we had a change in the direction of where the country was going, but it was also mirrored in a change in my own maturity and my asking of questions and my continuing discomfort with the answers that I was getting. I had grown up with a very close-knit family. It was a Czech family, very tightly knit, and they were 100% against even talking to me about it. I tried to discuss this with my parents and got nowhere, and finally decided that what I was asking them to do, when I was asking them to listen to me, was essentially set 50 years of the very foundation and building blocks around which they had based their lives, to set them aside and have another look at it, and I just realized that's just not going to happen. The irony, of course, is that after I had left, and that negativism really did continue, the best ally that I had in rebuilding those, some of those family ties, was Dick Nixon, because he turned out to be such a liar that so many of the things that I had been telling my family, in retrospect, they had to keep saying, well, yeah, but Dennis told us that this was happening, and they were forced to finally take a fresh look at some of the issues that I tried to discuss with him. It occurred to me to go and find us a cushy job someplace. I'm sure that I could have done that. I had a lot of experience through Scouts, and I'm sure that I could have found myself a desk job someplace. I had some problems with the ethics of that, because basically if you're just doing that, well, then you're just allowing some other poor schmuck to go to the front line and get it, and that didn't feel fair. I looked at prison, and actually considered going to California to be caught for draft evasion, because the penalties were quite a bit less if I was caught there than if I had been caught in Iowa. By that time, I think I was just so angry with the system, and I had tried to find alternatives and everything, that I was angry enough and disappointed enough that I didn't really feel that I owed the U.S. another 5 years of my life. Conscientious objector status in the draft area that I was absolutely out of the question. I came from a university town. 87% of my high school class went on to university. University deferrals were thick, and I was included in that for a while. They needed guys so badly that there was 2 birthright Quakers that weren't allowed CO status until they spent some time in jail and were eventually ordered to be given it by the court. So not being born a Quaker, my chances of a CO status were virtually nil, even though I attempted a variety of things like that. And so I really left Canada as sort of the last resort. And the decision sort of gradually became, okay, this is the only option that I have left, so let's have a look at it. I had all my job interview stuff together. We needed a job offer. I had that on letterhead. I needed some character references, had a bunch of those, had job references all lined up and everything together. And you also needed $300 in cash. Now, I had it, but one of the things that was interesting was that the Quakers were very good about lending war resistors. If they needed the $300 to show at the border, they'd lend you the $300 and they'd tell you, well, if you can pay it back someday, that's wonderful, but you guys are often coming in here with the shirt on your back, so don't worry about it. I've had a soft spot in my heart for the Quakers ever since. They're an amazing group. Anyway, when I left Toronto to join, or to go back, I was given a phone number. They asked me, when am I planning on coming through to apply for the landed status? And so I gave them a date and an estimated time, and they gave me a phone number in Windsor, which is across the border, of course, from Detroit, where I was landing. And they said, phone this number before you cross. And I got there, I guess it was about 6 o'clock, and they said, well, hold off, and phone back at around 8. And I phoned back at 8, and they said, well, come on ahead. And what they were doing is that they were monitoring who were the immigration officials manning the posts at virtually all of the borders, certainly in Ontario, and I would expect most of them across Canada. An incredibly well-organized machine, and they knew the political stances of everybody along there. And so what they had asked for me to do was to wait until there was a new shift on, and I pulled up and I told them that I wanted to immigrate, and went into the desk and basically laid it out and said, here's character reference, here's job references, here's the application. And my interview, which was supposed to be fairly extensive, consisted mainly of me sitting there while this fellow filled out papers, and the total extent of my interview was when he reached his hand across the table or the desk and welcomed me to Canada as an immigrant. That was it. So it was very simple, and it was made much easier by the support from the groups in Toronto. So when it's all said and done, somehow you've got to be able to stand in front of the mirror in the morning and look at yourself and believe that you're a decent human being. And I saw an awful lot of my friends that came back that couldn't believe that. So first and foremost, it was, I can't support this action. I can't support it even to the extent of going into the Army and taking a desk job, so it'll cover my own ass, but it's not. But it just means that some other person is going to be on the lines. And so my first thing was I had to resist that as a personal thing. It wasn't a matter of gain. It wasn't a matter of not gain. It was just a matter of I didn't have any other options. Now, looking back, it turns out I believe that it was probably one of the most effective political actions that I ever took. It caused a lot of people that were close to me to really start to question some of their own values. I think that the number of people who resisted the draft has been grossly underestimated. I don't think that the U.S. at that time could afford to let it be known how much resistance there was to that war. And collectively, we stopped that war. I mean, all the other people that eventually started to say, no, this isn't right. Of the people that I know that went, most of them, when they went, they were younger. I think if you're going to make somebody into a decent soldier, you've got to get them when they're still immortal. Or believe they're still immortal. Because once they get to the point where they're starting to ask questions of what are we doing here and why are we doing this, I'm not sure you can mold them as well. And so for me, part of it was maybe age, maybe a bit of maturity. You're taught as you go through high school or university or whatever, or just a few knocks in the world, to ask some questions and take a good look at the answers. And as I said, if they'd gotten me when I was 18 and, well, just out of high school, I would have gone, and I probably would have been so committed that I would have come back in a box, because I would have been trying to be a hero, and I probably would have had a life expectancy out there of about 10 minutes. Because that was just where I was at when I was just out of high school, and I hadn't started to really question what we were doing. As I questioned more and got different answers, I don't think that it makes that I was really any different from anybody else. The other people, had they too had the opportunity to ask questions, a lot of them came to the same conclusions that I did. It's awfully easy, if we're not challenged, to sort of live our lives along the path of least resistance. And in many ways, I'm glad that I was forced at that age to absolutely examine the fundamental building blocks around which I had built my life. And that includes my belief in the political structure of the U.S., some of my religious beliefs, everything, my belief in family. Making these decisions shook it to the very foundation. And when we're in our early 20s, it's actually a pretty good time in our life to do that, rather than waiting until we're 60 or 70 years old and it's too late to do anything about it. So yes, I was forced to examine every facet of my life, and when I put it back together, I put it back together in ways that meant something to me, not something that I'd sort of inherited because it was easy. I think it's pretty hard to say, that any war was good fortune. I just think that as a race, we're going to have to find better ways of doing business than killing each other. And I don't know that it's a great opportunity when you're faced with participating in one against your will. And I don't know that I'd take myself so seriously as to think that I had a key role in history. I think that throughout history, though, there have been wars, and throughout history we've been killing each other for a variety of reasons. Some better than others, but none very good. And along the way, there have been a few more people starting to say, well, let's see if there's some other way to do this. And so I guess I'd just say, I'm one person among hopefully a growing number of people that are trying to push the world in that direction.
I had been in high school. I was a kind of an all-American kid. I was president of my senior class. I was president of the National Honor Society. The whole 9 yards. I was a champion tennis player in my county. I'm sure I was expected to be, on the straight and narrow. And I went off to school, to college, really not particularly knowing what I was going to do at all, and not being politicized at that point. Although, as I look back, there were several instances in high school where there were certainly indications that I was going to have some political consciousness at some point. But the reality is, in high school at that time, and I probably still now, really young people are not exposed, by and large, to political ideas that are at all contrary to the status quo. When I made the decision, my parents were upset. They thought I was, maybe it was a stage, a phase that I would get out of shortly, and when that didn't seem like it was going to be the case, I remember I actually learned this later, a number of years later. My father, who was a bank manager at that time, and I was tried in Syracuse, so there was some visibility in Syracuse, although not a lot. There were no demonstrations. It was very solitary for the most part. A few friends and my family, and a pacifist lawyer in Syracuse, actually, who became a friend. My father went to the executives at the bank and offered to resign over the case. And I guess they said that was fine. He didn't need to do that, but that gives you some indication of how they perceived it and how they thought other people would think about it. I would also say, though, that I was in prison with a number of resistors, especially white resistors, whose parents had completely disowned them. I mean, they were just not welcome in their homes anymore. And my parents never did that. They maintained their love for me, and I through something that they had no idea. They just didn't have really a clue what was going on, and there was no way to bring those ideas to them in any kind of meaningful way. I think later, as my sister was actually one of my main supporters. There's only two of us. I think they began to realize more clearly what that meant and what the values behind it were, and that in some ways they were responsible for those values. I had a couple faculty members early in my freshman year, I guess, and perhaps my sophomore year, who really introduced me to some ideas and some reading that I had never been in touch with before. And then a friend of mine, between my freshman and sophomore year, we hitchhiked out to the West Coast, across the country, and his family actually was involved in some somewhat political and somewhat eccentric kinds of things, like a New World University, and they introduced me to the Peacemaker, which is a small kind of movement, anti-pacifist movement. Again, things that were just like, they were earth-shattering to me at that point, I'm sure. And so I just started devouring all this stuff. And then at the same time, I was learning about the war, this war that was starting to go on. And so I went back to school, and another thing I think was pushing me in terms of radicalization, particularly about militarism, was that I was at Michigan State University, and we were required to be enrolled in ROTC. All incoming freshman males were required to take it for 4 years. And so I focused on, that was one of my first focuses for rebellion, in a sense. I did everything I could to try to sabotage the ROTC program. And I got several friends to join in with me. And that wasn't necessarily connected to the war. It was just connected to this sense of outrage at militarism and what that represented. And then gradually, of course, I began to see those connections between ROTC and the war. At some point, I decided that I was going to take what then was called an absolutist position. My reading and my thinking had led me to the point where I felt that if a country had conscription, there were always going to be unjust wars, because the government essentially could fight any kind of war and tell its citizens they were going to fight, and they had no choice. So that was one of the first things I directed myself at, and So when I came to that conclusion, I had to say, well, then I can't have anything to do with the selective service system. I'm just going to say that it's illegitimate, and I'm not going to cooperate with it in any way. So I sent one letter to my draft board, which was in Syracuse, and I said essentially that you know, I understand that you're private citizens, and I will be happy to talk to you as a private citizen at any point you'd like, but I'm not going to have any more formal contact with you as a selective service board. And of course they weren't real excited about that, and so they, you know, I got a succession of letters, perfunctory letters. I never got any personal response whatsoever from anybody, and those of course escalated, and you know, if you don't do this, we're going to do this kind of thing, and I just, you know, I didn't respond to any of them, and eventually they sent me a notice to report for physical, and then a notice to report for induction, none of which I responded to in any way. And it was a very difficult period in my life. I was not part of, there really wasn't particularly an anti-war movement, you know, to offer me support, or resistance movement, or what there was, I was not plugged into. So I really got most of my support from my sister, my family, and you know, a small circle of friends. But it was a very difficult couple of years, because I essentially was just I knew I was going to go to prison, and I was just trying to occupy my life while waiting for that to happen. And then I was working on my sister's house, actually, south of Chicago, and the FBI arrived and arrested me, and I was taken to Chicago, to Cook County prison, which is, by any standard, you know, in the bottom rung of county prisons in the United States. It was an amazing place. Really degrading conditions for prisoners, and I was put on the federal tier, as they called it, which was for federal prisoners who were being held for one reason or another, which was the best spot in the prison, and we still got gruel twice a day. It was like out of Dickens, you know. I mean, it was, and I, you know, people say to me, "My God, that was your first prison experience," and you continued. Because, you know, that, I mean, I spent 2 years in federal prisons, and those were palaces compared to that. I was actually relieved to sort of have the process starting, you know, and to know that it was going to happen. And then I came back to Syracuse. I got in touch with this, actually an ACLU lawyer got me out of Cook County, a man named Drake, can't remember his first name. And he put me in touch with this lawyer in Syracuse who turned out to be a pacifist, and he had been in World War I and had become a pacifist after that. And he kept trying to convince me to be a CO. And he was in one of the most prestigious law firms in Syracuse, so he had quite a bit of clout with the judge. And the judge kept putting off the trial, even though I didn't really want him to, but he would, then I would go into my lawyer's office, and he would give me books to read that would convince me that I should be cooperating and should apply for a CO. I said, you know, you'll qualify for CO. You know, I'll make sure that, you know, that'd be fine. I'm not sure he ever really understood why I didn't want to cooperate, you know, with the selective service system. And it also was very clearly, I had developed a real egalitarian sense of things, and it was clearly a privileged status that was being given to people, particularly people from traditional religions. You know, we're kind of granted it routinely. For example, when I got to prison, I found out that Muslims and Jehovah's Witnesses were not given, you know, CO status, because there are a lot of them in the joints. And then another part of my refusal with the system was, you know, I was a college student. I knew that I could have gotten a college student deferment. They were being given to college students. I felt that was, you know, we let the poor people and the people of color fight the wars, and the more privileged kids will go to college and, you know, run the country. That's the way. That's a tidy program. But anyway, I wasn't subscribing to it. When I got out of prison, I did just about 2 years. That's what they were doing at that time. Later, of course, some judges in some areas, like in New York City, were congratulating resistors for resisting the draft by the time 70 and 71 rolled around. But my probation officer, when I got out, I was on probation for 4 years, turned out to be somewhat of an anti-war activist. which he very sort of quietly acknowledged to me. But he let me, I worked for about 9 months for a local pharmaceutical company in Syracuse, and then he let me go to work for the Syracuse Peace Council, which was the major anti-war organization in central New York. So if it hadn't been for him, I'm sure most probation officers were not allowing, people in their charge to do that kind of work. My life probably would have been significantly different, because that was my really first, 1970 I started working there, and that was really my first exposure to kind of the organized movement. I had some in prison, but it's kind of hard to do a lot of organizing in prison, as I found out. Personally, I think that, I did the right thing. I tried to stop a war and, a direction for the United States that is immoral. There's no other way to put it. It simply is immoral, and has resulted in the deaths and suffering of people around the world, and continues to this day to do the same thing. Unfortunately, U.S. imperialism and U.S. militarism and now globalization, which is the most recent form of imperialism, is the results are always the same. People with power and people with money become more so, and people that at the lower end, and increasingly people even in the middle, workers, middle class people, are being squeezed. So I'm proud of what I did, and I'm proud of people that do comparable things now and who did them, during the time I did. Politically, I think I played a role in helping to build a movement. Certainly in Syracuse, the Peace Council became a really significant force in terms of educating people about the war, and hopefully the role of the U.S. government around the world. I mean, the government is, the government, and it's not just the government, certainly. It's a sort of coalition of forces, economic forces, huge corporations, the media. It's in none of their interest to have movements like the draft resistance movement known about. That's why such a struggle to get them in front of students in schools. It's not a coincidence that, at the same time, it's not probably a big conspiracy, but it's not a coincidence that none of this information is available to people. It empowers people to be able to see that, when I say to young people today, I talk to them about something like the draft resistance, or just what it was like during the Vietnam era. People are just aghast, that there was that much social movement in this country at that time, because, certainly it's a pretty accurate perception to say that the U.S. isn't ranking very high in social activism at this point, around the world. I mean, one of the things we're fighting is, to just give a quick example, is this stuff about genetically modified food. Every other country in the world, just about, people are outraged about this stuff. Europe has banned it. Canada's banned most of it. India, a country that where there's a 50% literacy rate. And in the United States, people barely know what the heck it is. I go up to somebody and say, well, what are your position on genetically modified food? What? And it's not their fault, necessarily. But it's, it's just an example of how this country is depoliticized. So, and part of that process is, not talking about the history, making it invisible, marginalizing it.
I looked at the options before me, and I tried to think each one through, what I could do. So I tried to do it through a logical way, and I had friends in the States who would say things like, well, there's other ways to deal with this. And I said, well, you tell me and I'll be happy to look at them. And they couldn't tell me. So I prepared myself for coming to Canada. I came here in September of '68 to check out the situation. And the border crossing guard, the Canadian immigration official at Rock Island, Quebec, had said, "Are you coming to Canada to live?" I said, "At some point, yes." And he says, "Well, when you decide to move here, you be sure to cross at this border crossing and there'll be no problem giving you landed immigrant status." So a month later, I crossed at that border crossing and I got my landed immigrant paper, what Americans call green card, within 15 minutes.
Really?
Yes. And I knew not to go through Buffalo or Detroit, Windsor, because I had heard through the Toronto anti-draft program that they were staffed by World War II veterans who took a dim view of American war resistors. So I went out, and I also had, before I came to Canada, I had arranged for a job offer working at the Harold King Farm in Keswick. So with that letter, I was able to cross the border because I had a job guarantee. So I tried to do everything I could beforehand to smooth my way into Canada. It was obvious to me that I didn't want to go to war, period, regardless. And maybe it's some other war I would have gone to. But this one was so obviously bogus, was so obviously corrupt. It was just, there was no way I could see myself supporting it in any way. And I felt it was important to do the right thing for the right reason. So that if the government had given me CO status, that would have been fine with me. And I applied for CO status. But they weren't willing to recognize my objection to the war on moral grounds. So that only left the option of going to Canada or going to jail. And I think my parents had a hard time understanding that I wasn't, I couldn't give in. I couldn't compromise that. I started attending meeting for worship at the Hartford monthly meeting of Friends, Society of Friends. They're a pacifist organization, religion. And my first, I think my first few weeks in Canada, I got a big can of cookies from a member of the meeting, and that made a big impression on me. When I came to Canada, some members of Toronto meeting, they put me up in their home for several days, a few weeks, I think, until I could get myself organized. So the Quakers were very supportive, both in the States and here in Canada. I'm not a Christian. I don't buy the ideology and the theology, but with Friends, you're not required to. So it's, I always tell people I'm a non-Christian Jewish Quaker. So there are a lot of Jewish Quakers, so people who don't know find it kind of strange, but it's fairly common. When you take a stand on something that you feel you have to, you have no other option but to do a certain thing, and it's a very difficult thing, and you follow through on it, and you endure whatever the consequences and rewards are. It's a very empowering kind of thing. It's a very assuring thing. It's a very affirmative thing to go through. Regardless of what would have happened, it was something that I had to do. I think growing up Jewish, even though I was a rather secular Jew, and our family was not very observant, I still identified as a Jew. We were Jewish. We are Jewish. I grew up in the Deep South in Jacksonville, Florida. I remember the civil rights struggle. I remember the blacks being attacked in Hemming Park in Jacksonville while the police stood by and did nothing. I remember churches and synagogues being bombed, not only in Jacksonville, but other parts of the South, and still are in the South today, unfortunately. Whatever that's all about, I don't know. And as a teenager, wanting to do something, feeling so outraged at the injustice done to blacks, and just feeling utterly frustrated, not knowing what to do, I had decided in my own life that if I ever had to make a decision in the future, if the opportunity ever presented itself where I had to stand my ground, that I would do so. And the war in Vietnam was that opportunity for me to stand my ground. It's like I wasn't going to avoid another difficult situation and feel guilty for the rest of my life, like, why didn't you do something, Charlie? Here was your opportunity and you did nothing. My opportunity arrived and I felt I had to do something. So I think that was a part of the motivation as well. And also around that time I became aware of I.F. Stone. He was a journalist, and he had the Eye of Stone Weekly, and he was amazing. He would just reading papers laboriously and going through newscasts, he would pick out real gems, and it was obvious from what I was reading and what he was reading and listening on the news. It was obvious that we were being lied to. You know, I mean, you didn't have to be an Einstein to realize that there's something wrong here, and yet a lot of people didn't see it. So, but it was obvious to me real early that, well, I shouldn't say real early, maybe in '67, that there was something drastically wrong here. I'm one of probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who protested the war in one way or the other. And had it not been for all that protest, the war would not have ended when it did. So I think standing my ground as one individual among many, 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 many others had the effect of shortening the war. And had we been able to mobilize even more people sooner, it would have ended even sooner. So I think I was one person adding my voice to many others, and it was, who knows which one was the straw that broke the camel's back. But we were all straws on the camel's back, and at some point the back broke. So that's how I see my role, one of many.
All I can do is talk about my own history. I was was born into a Quaker family, and Coffins have been Quakers for 300 years. It's one of the old line Quaker families from Nantucket, and have been intimately involved in Quaker history in this country since almost from the beginning. So I came into being a pacifist, being against war, and very naturally as part of my religious tradition. I burned my draft card in October of 1967 at Independence Hall. And the whole idea of resistance was a little bit alien to my tradition because, but not a lot, but a little bit. My father had been a conscientious objector in World War II and had been in CPS, Civilian Public Service, which was alternative service, had worked at a mental hospital as a director of a mental hospital in Spokane, Washington, where I was born, and then had been a smoke jumper. He was, during the war, there was a group of conscientious objectors that spent the war jumping out of airplanes, putting out forest fires. So I grew up on those kind of stories, and I never saw conscientious objection as being anything but natural and very certainly not cowardly. It was to me a very brave thing to do, and the challenges that those men faced in the face of what was a universally popular war were far greater than anything that my generation faced. My teenage rebellion, if you will, was to flirt with the military. You know, other people rebelled against their parents by saying, you know, well, I'm going to burn my draft card or something. I flirted with, well, I'm this tough kid. I'm going to go join the Marines. And my poor mother was just brokenhearted. Well, I did that for about 6 months, but it was it was the civil rights movement really which taught me that nonviolence is an to actively practice nonviolence requires an extraordinary amount of courage, and as a young man, being able to display courage was important. And I guess it's part of my psyche at this point. It's, you know, maybe that's one of the reasons I go out and climb rocks and, you know, and do those kind of risky things. But I went to some meetings in spring of '67 where David Harris and a few other people were talking about building a resistance movement, a draft resistance movement, consciously naming it after the French resistance, and articulating this political idea that we could have people taking an active moral stance, fill up the jails. Well, of course, we never did, because even though literally tens of thousands of men burned their draft cards, turned them in, tens of thousands, a very small group was selectively prosecuted. Very small. And none of us thought that the government would deal with this simply by ignoring it. I discovered years later that I'd simply been reclassified. I burned my draft card. I sent photographs of it with the statement that I read to the draft board, and nothing ever happened. In summer of 1967, I had been, in the previous spring in early summer, I'd been in San Francisco. I was sort of on the hippie trail. We'd already come out of, the civil rights movement had gone through the beginnings of the Black Power movement. Those of us that were white were not welcome. And we're frankly trying to sort out our feelings about that. At least I was. And I met my parents in Philadelphia, and Hugh Taylor, was a very, very dear friend of my father. And we were having dinner at Hugh Taylor's house with his two daughters, and his son had recently committed suicide, or about 6 months earlier, had committed suicide. And his father was devastated. And his son had been very active in the Boy Scouts. And the Boy Scouts had planned, his troop was going to march in a pro-Vietnam War Loyalty Day kind of a parade. And he said, as a Quaker and a pacifist, I can't participate in that. And he was ostracized, and they drummed him out of the troop. And he went home and he hung himself. He was and Hugh Taylor was devastated. That had a tremendous effect on me. I can't tell you how much it affected me. And I went from there into Philadelphia and searched out to see if there was if there was a resistance group there. I came through a real bad period in this country's history with my integrity intact. I did the right thing. Today, the revisionist history of the mass media, glorifying the Vietnam veteran, glorifying the people that did the wrong thing, glorifying people who took the power and the technology of this country to torture and devastate a peasant people, and I never had any difficulty, to this day I never have had difficulty saying that the courageous thing in that period was to burn your draft card. Everything else was a compromise. In 1971, when the Vietnam Veterans Against the War was formed, I was very involved with those men and spent a lot of time talking with them. And it's a lie and a canard to say that the anti-war movement ever spit on or degraded the soldiers that were trapped in a system, that were drafted.
I think it's a lie too.
It's an absolute lie, and it's promoted by the same kind of right-wing forces that glorify all aspects of militarism. When I go into a period when when I do that kind of lifetime reassessment, when it happens most is when I've done something that I'm ashamed of. I have a quick temper, and sometimes I'll say things that I really don't mean, and I can hurt people, and I'm ashamed of it. And if I do something that I'm ashamed of, this always brings me back. That the world, that if I die without going to that person and apologizing, the world is still a better place because I lived. I can say that. If I never accomplished anything more in my life, the world is a better place because I lived. And that's something to really, that gets you through the hard times. It gets me through the hard times. I know what love is about. Not romantic love. I know what love is about. Where people will make tremendous sacrifices for one another, for something bigger than themselves. And with the hope, but no guarantee of success. And not because there's a payoff, but because it's the right thing to do.
I'm gonna put on that long white robe down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna put on that long white robe down by the riverside and study war no more. I ain't gonna 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 study war no more. I'm gonna put on that starry crown down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna put on that starry crown down by the riverside and study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Study war no more, no more, no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study